"Who fixed this?" Arthur Shaw asked, his voice cutting through the dying alarm. Marcus Vale stepped forward with a folder pressed to his chest, but the first worker pointed past him. Then another did. Within seconds, every hand in the control room aimed at Daniel Mercer, the fired single father gripping a transfer lever with blood running over his knuckles. Beside him, a blue maintenance notebook lay open beneath a scratched silver star. Evelyn Shaw stared at the severed security badge protruding from Dan's pocket. "It was our approved recovery sequence," Marcus said quickly. Dan never looked up. "Ask who saved the machine later," he said. "First ask who's still inside." The pressure gauge above him trembled. A green light flickered back to red, and the signal from the east corridor vanished. 6 hours earlier, the fluorescent lights in the glass conference room had hummed half a note sharper than the relay bank on the factory floor. Dan noticed it because he noticed sounds other people trained themselves to ignore. He stood at the end of the polished table in his faded blue-gray work shirt, one hand resting beside the maintenance notebook he had carried for 14 years. Oil had darkened the edges of its pages. A burn mark curled one corner. The silver star Lily had placed on the cover for her 10th birthday was scraped nearly white. Marcus sat across from him in a charcoal suit, his expression arranged into something close to sympathy. On the wall screen, Dan's warnings had been reorganized into neat red boxes labeled resistance incidents. "No one is questioning your dedication," Marcus said, "but modernization requires trust, adaptability, and a healthier balance. You've been carrying too much since becoming Lily's only parent." Dan looked at the box of tissues Marcus had pushed toward him. Then he looked through the glass at the workers changing shifts below. Men and women in safety vests moved between yellow lines while the eastern compressor pulsed with a faint, uneven shudder. Evelyn stood near the screen, arms folded. At 38, she had inherited authority before earning anyone's patience, and every person in the room knew the board was measuring whether she could make hard decisions without hesitation. "Did you submit the relay concern through the official system?" she asked. 3 times. "The records show no verified fault." Dan opened the notebook to a page marked with 3 red circles. "The records were changed after I submitted them." Marcus gave a careful sigh, not quite dismissive enough to sound cruel. "Handwritten impressions are not the same as validated data." Dan turned the notebook toward Evelyn. Next to the temperature readings, he had written, "Dashboard lags 3 minutes under load." A brown scorch marked the paper beneath the words. "Before the night shift starts, inspect the east relay by hand," he said. "Don't trust the dashboard." Evelyn's gaze paused on the burn mark, but Marcus touched the remote and replaced the page on the screen with Dan's termination agreement. "We're not punishing you," he said softly. "We're giving you time to be a father." Dan's jaw tightened once. "Then don't use my daughter to make this look kind." The room went still. He removed his security badge, placed it squarely on the agreement, and walked out without touching the tissues. Through the closing glass door, he heard Marcus lower his voice. "Disable his access before the night inspection." Dan stopped in the hallway. Marcus had just claimed he had never read the notebook, yet he had known the warning was about the East Relay before Dan ever opened to that page. Dan remained in the hallway for 1 breath longer, his hand still resting on the cold metal handle. "The East Relay?" he asked through the narrowing gap. "Your access is terminated," Marcus replied. "Security will escort you." The glass door clicked shut before Dan could answer. Fluorescent light flattened his reflection against the wall. Faded work shirt, oil-darkened cuffs, safety boots worn pale at the toes. Behind the glass, Marcus leaned toward Evelyn and spoke softly enough to appear respectful, but loudly enough for the Human Resources Director to hear. "This is exactly the escalation risk I warned about." A security supervisor approached carrying a gray property bin. "Badge, radio, locker key." "The badge is on the table." "Then the radio and key." "My tools are still on the floor." The supervisor glanced at Marcus through the glass. Marcus gave a small, regretful shake of his head. "Company policy doesn't allow separated employees back into controlled areas," he said. We'll inventory everything and mail what belongs to him. Dan looked through the window toward the maintenance bay. His toolbox sat beneath the steel bench, its lid scratched with Lily's initials from the afternoon she had waited there during a school closure. Beside it was the insulated lunch bag she had packed that morning, a paper napkin folded over the handle. "There's medication in the side pocket," Dan said. "For me, not the machines." The human resources director smiled as though calming someone difficult. "We'll make sure personal items are handled appropriately." Two supervisors passed behind Dan, slowing when they recognized him. One looked at the severed badge on the conference table and murmured, "Guess the old school thing finally caught up with him." The other nodded toward Dan's stained sleeves. "Can't run a modern plant out of a grease notebook." Dan heard them. He did not turn. Instead, he reached into his shirt pocket, removed a folded maintenance tag, and handed it to the security supervisor. "Bay 4 has a loose floor plate. Owen almost caught his boot on it this morning. Mark it before night shift." The supervisor stared at the tag. "You're worried about a floor plate right now? Someone can still fall after I'm gone." For the first time, Evelyn looked away from the termination agreement. Through the glass, she watched Dan bend to pick up a dropped safety cone and place it beside the loose threshold where people kept stepping around it. He did it without looking toward her, without asking anyone to notice. Marcus followed her gaze. "He has trouble letting go," he said gently. Men in roles like his sometimes confuse familiarity with authority. Evelyn's eyes returned to the blue notebook on the table. The silver star was scratched, the cover swollen from years of oil and heat. Near the corner, the small burn mark had eaten through 3 pages in the same place. "Why did he still have handwritten records?" she asked. "Habit," Marcus said, "and resistance to accountability." He said the digital reports were altered, a serious claim from an employee facing separation. Marcus slid the notebook into the property bin before she could touch it. "Legal should hold this, so no one can accuse us of mishandling evidence." His tone remained calm, almost protective, yet his thumb pressed directly over the page marked with the East Relay warning. In the hallway, the supervisor handed Dan a printed receipt for the items being withheld. The timestamp read 2:46 p.m. Dan looked through the glass at the wall clock inside the conference room. It was 2:43. "This receipt was generated 3 minutes ahead," he said. "System clocks drift," the supervisor replied. "Not all of them in the same direction." Dan folded the receipt and placed it beside Lily's paracord bracelet on his wrist. Marcus opened the door just wide enough to pass out a confidentiality form. "Sign this, and we can keep the separation clean." Dan read the first page. The paper carried the faint chemical smell of a fresh printer, but his employee number had already been typed beneath a statement saying he accepted responsibility for delayed relay maintenance. "I won't sign something that isn't true." Marcus lowered his voice. "Think about future references. Think about your daughter." Dan placed the form back in Marcus's hand. "I am." He walked toward the exit while the security supervisor followed 3 steps behind. At the turnstile, Dan glanced back once. Evelyn was standing alone beside the property bin, looking at the handwritten warning Marcus claimed he had never seen. His thumbprint had left a clean crescent in the oil exactly beside the words East Relay. Dan saw the crescent-shaped thumbprint beside the words East Relay, but he did not turn back. Marcus had already closed the glass door, and Evelyn was still staring at the notebook as if the oil stain might explain something the reports had not. Outside, the afternoon air smelled of hot asphalt and machine coolant drifting from the loading bays. Dan reached his truck, opened the passenger door, and found the paper napkin Lily had tucked into his lunch bag. That morning, in purple marker, she had drawn 2 uneven stick figures holding hands beneath a silver star. He folded it carefully and placed it inside his shirt pocket before starting the engine. The fuel gauge hovered just above empty. His phone showed a rent reminder, a missed call from the electric company, and a message from Lily's school saying the science fair fee was due the next morning. He sat for 3 seconds with both hands on the wheel, then drove toward Jefferson Elementary. Lily came through the side doors carrying a foam-board volcano almost as wide as her shoulders. One cardboard slope had collapsed, and red paint had dried across her fingers. "Dad, it broke in math," she said. "The mountain or the math?" "Both." He took the board without laughing too loudly, because she was trying not to cry. On the curb, he knelt and used a strip of silver duct tape from his truck to brace the underside where no one would see it. Lily watched his hands work. "Mrs. Hall said the fee is $20. "I know. We can skip it." "No, we can't." He opened his wallet. One $20 bill rested inside beside a faded photograph of Lily's mother. It was the last cash he had until he found another job. He placed it in Lily's paint-stained hand and closed her fingers around it. "Your mountain gets to erupt." She looked at him longer than a 10-year-old usually looked at money. "Did something happen at work?" Dan lifted the repaired volcano into the truck. "A machine made a bad noise. Did you fix it?" "Not today." She climbed in, unconvinced, and pulled the seat belt across her chest. As Dan shut her door, the old emergency radio mounted beneath the dashboard cracked with static. Most employees used company phones now, but Dan had kept the analog receiver because radio waves sometimes reached places digital signals did not. A voice broke through the noise. "East line pressure climbing. Control says sensor fault." Another voice answered, clipped and hurried. "Continue startup. We cannot miss the shipping window." Dan froze with one hand on the doorframe. The truck idled unevenly, sending a tremor through the steering column. "Is that your machine?" Lily asked. The radio hissed again. "Access door is not responding." Dan reached beneath the seat and pulled out his blue maintenance notebook. Security had placed it in the property bin, but the supervisor must have returned it with his lunch bag before he left. The silver star on the cover was scratched, and Marcus's clean thumbprint still cut through the oil near the edge. Dan turned to the page marked East Relay. His fingers stopped at the handwritten warning. Dashboard lags 3 minutes under load. Lily leaned closer but did not try to read the technical notes. She touched the star instead. "It got scraped." "I see that. I put it there on my birthday." Dan looked at the small letters she had written beneath it months earlier. "LB Fix." A private shorthand no engineer would have used. He closed the notebook and called Mrs. Green, the retired nurse who lived 2 houses down. 10 minutes later, Dan parked in her driveway. He carried Lily's volcano inside, set it carefully on the kitchen table, and gave Mrs. Green the grocery bag from his truck even though it held the dinner he had planned for himself. "There's enough pasta for both of you." "Daniel, you look pale." "Long day." Lily stood by the doorway holding the $20 bill. "Are you going back to the bad noise?" Dan crouched and tied the lace hanging loose from her sneaker. "I'm going to help some people get home." "Will you come back for the volcano?" "Before the paint dries." She slipped a roll of bandages from Mrs. Green's kitchen drawer into his pocket. "For the machine?" "Machines don't bleed." "Then for you." Dan touched her shoulder, stood, and walked back to the truck. At the plant gate, the security guard stepped outside before Dan had fully stopped. "You're not authorized to be here. Evacuate the east corridor. Control says it's a sensor issue." Dan placed his palm against the chain-link fence. Through the metal came a low vibration, then a second pulse half a beat late. It was not a sensor. It was a relay carrying load where no load should have been. "Call Evelyn Shaw. Mr. Vale said not to let you near the building. Then keep me here. Just move the workers." Inside the gatehouse, a monitor showed the east corridor camera turning slowly away from the access door. Dan stared at the screen. Marcus had called the camera lockout a precaution against panic. But the new angle no longer showed the warning light above the trapped worker's door. The guard followed Dan's gaze, and for the first time his hand stopped hovering over the phone. A deep metallic boom rolled through the fence. One row of factory lights went black. The radio on Dan's dashboard crackled, and a frightened voice said the corridor was getting hotter. Dan pulled the blue notebook from his pocket and opened it to the damaged page. Beneath Marcus's thumbprint, the oil had preserved a second, thinner line from the day Dan first recorded the fault, a line showing that someone had handled the warning before the digital report was changed. The guard's hand finally closed around the phone. "Ms. Shaw, he says the east corridor has to be cleared." He listened, glanced at Dan, then lowered his voice. "Yes, ma'am. He's the employee who was terminated." Through the gatehouse glass, the camera feed remained turned away from the warning light. Marcus's voice came over the speaker before Evelyn arrived. "Do not let him enter the plant. He may be attempting to interfere with an active response." Dan stood beneath the white security lamp, blue notebook open in one hand, while rain-dark oil from the fence marked his palm. The boom inside the building had stopped, but the silence afterward felt worse. "There are people behind that door," Dan said. "Control reports a false sensor alarm." "Then why did the camera move?" Marcus did not answer immediately. A pair of headlights swept across the gate. Evelyn's black sedan stopped beside the curb, and she stepped out without a coat, the termination papers still tucked beneath one arm. Her eyes moved from Dan to the notebook, then to the guard holding the phone as if it had become evidence. "You were instructed to leave company property," she said. "I left, and came back." The east relay changed rhythm. Marcus appeared on the gate monitor from the control room, his face calm beneath the blue light of the screens. "Evelyn, he has no access credentials, and he's emotionally invested in proving us wrong. We have licensed specialists handling this." Dan did not argue with the word emotional. He turned the notebook so Evelyn could see the page beneath the security lamp. The oil stain caught the light, revealing the faint second line under Marcus's thumbprint. "What time did Control say the fault began?" 8:17, Evelyn replied. "Look at the mechanical clock on the east panel." Marcus's expression tightened by less than a breath. "That clock has drifted for months." Evelyn looked back toward the factory. "Can we see it from here?" The guard switched monitors. The east panel appeared in grainy black and white. Its mechanical clock had stopped at 8:14. The digital event log beside it read 8:17. 3 minutes, Dan said. "The same delay I wrote down before I was fired." Marcus leaned closer to his camera. "A stopped clock proves nothing. Mechanical instruments fail. The digital system is the official record. Then check the local recording module. It's been offline since last week." Dan's gaze moved to the lower corner of the monitor, where a small status light blinked behind the panel door. "Why is its memory light still active?" No one spoke. Rain ticked against the gatehouse roof. Evelyn stepped closer to the screen, but Marcus recovered quickly. "Residual power. These modules can flash even when corrupted." "Then testing it should settle this," Dan said. "Not trusting me. Testing it." Evelyn looked at the guard. "Bring him in under escort. He touches nothing without authorization." Marcus objected at once, but he softened the words. "For liability reasons, I strongly recommend we keep a terminated employee away from critical systems." "For liability reasons," Evelyn said. "I want witnesses." Inside the plant, the air smelled of overheated insulation and hydraulic fluid. Workers stood behind yellow lines while supervisors whispered that Dan had returned to sabotage the recovery. One man moved aside as Dan passed, guarding his tablet like Dan might erase something by looking at it. Dan ignored the stares and stopped only to place a fallen safety cone over a slick patch of coolant. At the control room, Owen stood pale beside the eastern panel. "They said the module was dead," he whispered. "Don't say what they said," Dan replied. "Say what you saw." Owen swallowed. "Mr. Vale opened the panel yesterday. He told me it was routine." Marcus stepped between them. "Owen is a junior technician. He may be confusing normal maintenance with an emergency repair." Dan waited until Evelyn authorized the inspection, then asked Owen to record every movement on his phone and requested that the union steward stand beside him. He did not touch the module first. He pointed to the warranty seal under the fluorescent strip. The red adhesive had been sliced cleanly, and the exposed edge was still bright, untouched by dust. "Was this opened last week?" Dan asked. Marcus folded his arms. "Maintenance seals can remain clean." Dan angled the panel toward the light. A thin curl of fresh adhesive clung to the screw head. Evelyn saw it and said nothing, but her eyes no longer rested on Dan. They rested on Marcus. When Owen removed the cover, the recording module pulsed green. Marcus moved forward. Clear the cache before booting it. Dan looked up. Why clear anything before we know what's there? The room slowed. Marcus smiled as if the answer were obvious. Because corrupted memory can trigger another fault. Dan opened his notebook to the page marked 814 and held it beside the blinking module. The same 3-minute discrepancy appeared in both places, and for the first time he understood that the missing time was not merely a delay in the dashboard. Someone had opened the only device that could prove what happened during those 3 minutes. The green pulse inside the recording module continued at a steady interval while no one moved. Marcus broke the silence first. We do not have time for an evidence debate while employees are trapped. Then don't debate it, Dan said. Protect it. Owen's phone remained raised, recording the open panel, the cut seal, and every hand near the module. Evelyn looked through the control room glass toward the dark eastern corridor, then back at the pressure display. What gets the door open fastest without risking another failure? The outside. Specialist tapped the screen. We restore full power through the auxiliary branch. Dan listened as the relay bank clicked behind the wall. 3 quick metallic ticks came through the cabinet, followed by a pause and one heavier strike. His eyes shifted to the lower bus panel. Not full power. The specialist gave a tired breath. Mr. Mercer, this is not a tuning exercise. The contact is sticking. You cannot diagnose a sealed relay by ear, then test it without putting anyone behind it. Marcus folded his hands at his waist. Every minute we delay makes the situation worse. We should follow the approved recovery procedure. Dan looked at Evelyn, not Marcus. Give me an isolated load at 18%. If I'm wrong, you lose 40 seconds. If he's wrong, you lose the panel. The air conditioner clicked on above them, suddenly loud in the quiet. Evelyn studied the eastern pressure, the blinking module, and the workers gathered behind the glass. Can 18% open the door? No. Then what does it prove? Whether the branch survives long enough to try anything else. She nodded once. Do it. Marcus stepped closer. Evelyn. An improvised test by a terminated employee creates unnecessary exposure. So does energizing a circuit we haven't verified. She turned to Owen. Record the setup. Nobody deletes anything. Dan selected a simulator lead from the test cabinet and checked the insulation with his thumb. He handed the second lead to Owen, then noticed the young technician's glove had split along the index finger. Change it. We're already behind. Change it. Owen started to protest, but Dan pulled a new glove from the wall dispenser and waited until he put it on. Marcus watched with a thin smile. This is what I mean about delays becoming habits. Dan did not answer. He clipped the simulator to the isolated branch, stepped behind the safety line, and asked the specialist to raise the load in 2% increments. At 10%, the relay clicked normally. At 14, the fourth beat came late. At 16, Dan lifted one hand. Slow. The specialist's fingers hovered over the control. It's within tolerance. 18 only. The number rolled upward. A white spark snapped from the lower fuse housing with the sound of a breaking branch. Dan caught Owen by the shoulder and pulled him back as a ceramic fuse shot from the slot, struck the grated floor, and spun beneath the console. The room went still. A chair that had been scraping behind them stopped. Someone near the doorway quit whispering in the middle of a sentence. Dan waited until the indicator fell to 0, locked out the branch, and used insulated tongs to retrieve the fuse. A black line split its casing. Tiny printed letters ran along one side. VX 47B. Bag, Dan said. Owen brought an evidence pouch. Dan placed the fuse inside without wiping it and wrote the time on the label in pencil. He did not look at Marcus. That branch would have failed under full load. Evelyn lowered the termination papers onto the console. What fuse is specified? The specialist pulled up the procurement screen. Aerosafe R9. Aerospace rated. heat-resistant. Could this be a temporary substitute? Marcus asked calmly. That happens during supply disruptions. We should avoid turning a maintenance discrepancy into an accusation. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. How did you read the model number from there? Marcus glanced at the bag, then at the burned panel. I recognized the casing. From 20 feet away? I manage operations. I know our inventory. Dan turned the evidence pouch toward the overhead light. The VX-47B casing was dull gray, while the approved Aerosafe fuse pictured on the screen was white with a blue ceramic band. They did not resemble each other. Marcus recovered with a small nod. Then purchasing may have authorized a substitution without updating the display. Let me handle it privately before people draw the wrong conclusion. Dan looked through the glass at the workers waiting for news. Don't name anyone yet. Find out what went into every Eastline cabinet first. Evelyn's gaze moved to him. He had proof Marcus was wrong, but instead of using it to humiliate him, Dan was protecting the maintenance crew from being blamed before the facts were known. She took out her phone and sent a message to legal and procurement. Preserve original invoices. Freeze warehouse edits, no deletions. A reply arrived less than a minute later. Evelyn read it twice. The company paid for Aerosafe our 9 units 6 weeks ago. Marcus's jaw tightened, then relaxed. Then this is a receiving error. Another message appeared beneath the first. Evelyn's hand stopped above the screen. Warehouse says no Aerosafe shipment ever arrived. Dan looked at the blackened VX-47B in the evidence bag, then at the clean digital purchase order carrying his own employee approval. The signature was his name, but the stroke leaned the wrong way, and the timestamp showed it had been submitted while he was across town picking Lily up from school. The digital signature carrying Dan's name sat on the screen beside the blackened VX-47B fuse, and for several seconds no one spoke. That is your employee credential, Marcus said. Credentials are not fingerprints, Dan replied. Check where it was used. Evelyn's hand settled slowly on the edge of the console. The control room printers had stopped, leaving only the low breath of ventilation and the distant metallic strain from the east wing. Marcus leaned toward her with practiced concern. We should continue this privately. Public speculation could damage the company and Mr. Mercer's future. Dan looked through the glass at the workers gathered behind the yellow line. Some had already heard his name attached to the purchase order. One man avoided his eyes. Verify it before anyone repeats it, Dan said. Legal traced the approval to a workstation inside Marcus's office, but the login had occurred at 3:42 p.m. 2 Thursdays earlier. Dan took out his old phone, opened the calendar, and turned it toward Evelyn. The entry read, Lily, teacher conference, 3:30. A calendar entry can be added later, Marcus said. It can, Dan agreed. Call the school. He did not ask Lily to prove anything. He did not call Mrs. Hall and place a 10-year-old inside an adult accusation. He gave legal permission to request the school's visitor log, front lobby footage, and pickup record through official channels. Marcus wiped one thumb along the edge of his phone, then slipped it face down into his pocket. We are losing time, he said. Workers are still waiting on that door. Then let the evidence team work while we open it, Dan said. Evelyn watched him closely. He had a forged approval in front of him, enough to shout that Marcus had framed him, yet his attention remained on the east pressure display. She turned to the plant engineer. Can we release the first lock manually? If we stabilize the pneumatic feed. Dan opened the blue notebook beneath the scratched silver star and found the hand-drawn bypass route. The burn mark at the page corner lined up with the fuse location on the cabinet map. Feed it through the service regulator, he said. 6 pounds at a time. Stop if the lower pipe starts knocking. Marcus stepped between Dan and the diagram. That route is not in the approved recovery plan. It was removed from the copy. Dan placed his notebook beside Marcus's printed schematic. The original showed a narrow relief line running around the east branch. Marcus's version ended at a blank white margin. Owen stared at the 2 pages. That line used to be on the wall diagram. Marcus's voice sharpened for the first time. Owen, focus on your assignment. Then he softened it. You're under stress. Don't confuse an obsolete draft with the current system. A phone vibrated on the console. Legal had received the school records. The visitor log showed Dan signing in at 3:31. Lobby footage showed him carrying Lily's collapsed foam board at 3:39. A store receipt for poster board and red paint placed him 2 miles from the school at 3:47. The approval in his name had been created at 3:42 from Marcus's office. Evelyn read every line before she looked up. Her face did not soften with pity. It hardened with recognition. Freeze every approval issued from that workstation, she said. Not just this one. The audit returned more than a single irregularity. Over 4 months, 11 maintenance objections had been closed under employee credentials after those employees had left their shifts. 3 belonged to contractors no longer working at the plant. 2 reports warning about substitute parts had been rewritten as completed inspections. Marcus gave a small laugh that arrived too late. Shared terminals create messy records. That is not a conspiracy. Owen glanced toward the hallway camera. You told us never to share terminals. Marcus turned on him. I said focus. The words landed harder than he intended. Then the first east wing lock released with a deep hydraulic cough. 6 workers stumbled into the outer corridor, faces flushed, shirts dark with sweat. Dan counted them twice. Where are the others? The shift supervisor checked the roster. There should be 12. Marcus answered before anyone asked him. The remaining team was moved to the inner inspection chamber for production continuity. Evelyn stared at him. During a pressure warning? Before the warning became significant. Dan's eyes went to the mechanical clock frozen at 8:14, then to the blinking recording module. Legal had finished extracting a 47-second local audio file. Marcus stepped toward the console. That recording is corrupted. Do not play it until counsel reviews it. How do you know it's 47 seconds? Evelyn asked. Marcus stopped. No one had announced the length allowed. Legal isolated the audio and matched its background chime to a server call stored elsewhere. Through static came Marcus's voice. Log it under Mercer's approval. We'll correct it after launch. The room fell so quiet that the green pulse inside the recording module seemed loud. Dan could have demanded Marcus be removed then. Instead, he looked at the East Wing map and asked, Which chamber did you put the other 6 in? Marcus said nothing. Owen enlarged the personnel tracker. 6 red dots blinked behind the missing relief line on Marcus's diagram, in a chamber where the air pressure was still rising. Evelyn lifted the printed schematic, the forged approval, and the sealed fuse bag from the console. My father is on his way, she said, and this will not be handled behind a closed door. Arthur Shaw entered the glass meeting room without an entourage, carrying his old engineer's hard hat beneath one arm. Outside the walls, supervisors, technicians, union representatives, and the rescued workers stood in ordered rows along the factory floor. Dan remained near the door, his injured hand wrapped in Lily's bandage, his blue maintenance notebook held against his side. Marcus stood at the head of the table beside a clean printed schematic. Evelyn took the chair opposite him but did not speak. We need facts, Arthur said, not reputations. Marcus nodded with solemn relief. Then the facts are simple. Mr. Mercer maintained private notes, resisted the approved modernization plan, and returned after termination to interfere with an emergency response. A few people beyond the glass shifted uneasily. Marcus raised the printed recovery sequence. The route that stabilized the outer lock came from my operations plan. Mr. Mercer had access to earlier drafts and appears to have copied portions into his notebook. For one dangerous moment, the explanation fit the surface. Dan's name appeared on the purchase approval. His handwriting filled the blue notebook. He had returned after being ordered away. Marcus looked less like a thief than a manager trying to control a former employee who would not let go. Arthur turned to Dan. Did you enter this plant without authorization? I came to the gate. Did you direct the recovery? After Ms. Shaw allowed it. Did you keep maintenance records outside the official system? After the official records changed, Marcus placed both palms on the table. That is the pattern. Every safeguard becomes evidence of persecution when Daniel disagrees with a decision. Dan did not answer the insult. He opened the blue notebook and laid it beneath the meeting room lights. The scratched silver star caught a white reflection. Beside it, the burn mark curved through the page containing the missing relief route. Where did this plan come from? Arthur asked. I drew it from the physical piping, Dan said. Marcus lifted his copy. As did my engineering team. Dan looked at him. What does LB mean? Marcus glanced at the small initials written beside the bypass line. Load balance. His answer came smoothly. Several managers nodded as though the phrase closed the question. Dan touched the silver star with one finger. Lily's birthday. The room changed without anyone moving. She put the sticker there when she turned 10. Dan continued. I marked repairs I finished that night with LB so I'd remember why I was late getting home. Arthur took Marcus's schematic. The same initials appeared beside the copied relief route in identical handwriting, including the small backward hook Lily had drawn beneath the B. Marcus's lips parted, then closed. A copied notation does not establish theft, he said. Documents circulate. Someone on the maintenance team may have transferred it. Then show us when, Dan replied. Evelyn finally moved. She placed the sealed VX-47B fuse beside the notebook. Followed by the AeroSafe R9 invoice and the forged approval bearing Dan's name. The fuse proves the installed part did not match the invoice, she said. The school pickup record proves Dan could not have submitted the approval. Marcus's voice remained controlled. A compromised credential can be used by anyone. That does not make me responsible. No, Evelyn said. The camera does. She nodded to legal. The monitor on the wall changed from the pressure graph to hallway footage recorded 3 nights earlier. Marcus appeared outside the maintenance bay at 9:12 p.m. He waited until Owen left, entered with a master key, and emerged carrying Dan's blue notebook beneath a folded safety vest. The footage continued. 12 minutes later, Marcus returned the notebook to the toolbox and wiped its cover with his sleeve. Beyond the glass, the whispering stopped. Marcus stared at the screen. That was an authorized document review. You told us you had never seen it, Arthur said. Marcus shifted his weight toward the door. I misspoke during an emergency. Dan closed the notebook but did not take it away. This isn't about making you smaller, he said. It's about making sure no worker gets buried under your version of the record again. Evelyn's phone vibrated. Legal had recovered an email Marcus sent to the substitute parts contractor 6 weeks earlier. She projected it onto the wall. The subject line read East Line Savings. In the body, Marcus instructed the contractor to preserve an 11% productivity gain, remove the manual relief cycle from training materials and route objections through his office before they reached executive review. Arthur read the message twice. Evelyn stood. Her face reflected faintly in the glass beside the workers she had failed to protect. My signature terminated Daniel Mercer, she said. I accepted a clean report because it was easier than testing an inconvenient warning. Whatever Marcus falsified, my authority gave the lie its force. No one applauded. The admission was too heavy for that. Marcus's professional calm finally cracked at the edges. Sweat shone near his collar. His right hand disappeared beneath the table. Dan heard a faint vibration from Marcus's phone before the East Line alarm began again. On the wall map, the 6 remaining workers' red signals blinked once, then vanished. Owen checked the system log and went pale. Someone just triggered a remote reset. Arthur looked toward Marcus's hidden hand as legal opened the final access record on the screen. The final access record appeared on the wall screen before Marcus could move his hand away from the phone beneath the table. Remote command accepted. The log read. User, Vale OPS. Time, 9:06 p.m. The East Line schematic flashed red as pressure climbed behind the inner inspection chamber. Marcus stared at the screen, his mouth open but soundless. That account can be spoofed, he said at last. His voice had gone dry. Evelyn turned to legal. Lock his credentials. Preserve the device. Call emergency services and the investigators. 2 security officers stepped beside Marcus without touching him. He placed the phone on the table, but his fingers shook hard enough that the plastic clicked against the glass. Dan was already studying the pressure map. The automatic sequence is gone, Owen said. The reset wiped the door controls. Not the manual relief, Dan replied. Marcus's printed schematic showed only a blank margin where the bypass should have been. But Dan opened the blue notebook beneath Lily's scratched silver star. His hand moved across the burn-marked page until it reached the narrow east relief path. The valve is inside the service passage, Arthur said. That corridor could flash with steam. The workers are behind it. Daniel, Evelyn said. The fire team is almost here. A dull impact came through the wall, followed by 3 desperate strikes from inside the chamber. Dan listened to the interval between them. They don't have almost. He took a face shield from the emergency cabinet, wrapped Lily's spare bandage tighter around his palm, and handed the notebook to Owen. Read the pressure to me. Don't follow the dashboard. Use the mechanical gauge. Arthur stepped in front of him. You were fired today. You owe this company nothing. Dan looked through the glass at the red signals that had disappeared from the personnel tracker. I'm not doing it for the company. The service passage was narrow, hot, and lit by emergency strips along the floor. Dan moved with one shoulder against the pipes, listening to the knocking behind the steel. Owen's voice came through the radio. Mechanical gauge reads 142. Dashboard says 139. 3 minutes behind, Dan said. Keep reading the local gauge. At the manual relief station, the wheel had been wired shut beneath a maintenance tag marked "Do Not Operate." Dan cut the wire with insulated pliers. The first turn released a hiss so sharp it filled the passage like tearing metal. The valve kicked backward. Its edge split his palm through the bandage, and blood ran along the wheel. Pressure dropping, Owen said. 136. 128. Dan leaned his weight into the frozen handle. The paracord bracelet Lily had tied around his wrist dragged against the steel as the wheel turned another quarter rotation. Outer lock is responding, Evelyn said over the radio. Dan, come back. Not until the inner gauge falls below 90. Behind the door, the workers began coughing. The emergency lights fluttered. Dan kept the valve open until the mechanical needle slid to 88. Then he crossed to the chamber release and pulled the lever down with both hands. The door opened 6 inches. Hot air rushed through the gap. Dan braced his boot against the frame and forced it wider. Workers first, he said. One by one, the 6 trapped employees came through the passage, shielding their faces with their sleeves. Dan counted each person aloud. He did not leave until Owen confirmed the chamber was empty. When he returned to the factory floor, his face shield was fogged and his right hand was dark with blood. The alarm had fallen silent. Workers lined the yellow safety lane. The rescued team wrapped in emergency blankets near the loading doors. Marcus remained inside the glass meeting room between security officers. His folder had slipped to the floor, and pages lay scattered around his shoes. Arthur walked onto the factory floor and looked at the stabilized gauges, the open relief route, and the blue notebook Owen carried against his chest. Who fixed this? He asked. Marcus lifted his head as if he still expected someone to name him. No one spoke. The first rescued worker pointed toward Dan. Owen raised his hand next. Then the maintenance crew, the line supervisors, the union steward, and every worker standing beneath the fluorescent lights pointed to the fired single father beside the manual lever. Dan's termination papers were still visible through the glass behind him. Blood slipped from his knuckles to the concrete. The blue notebook rested beneath the scratched silver star in Owen's hands. In the silence, Legal played the recovered recording through the factory speakers. Marcus's voice filled the building. Skip the relief cycle. We need the 11%. Log it under Mercer's approval. A pen dropped inside the meeting room and struck the floor with a small, clean sound. Marcus lowered his eyes. Arthur faced the workers. Daniel Mercer's termination is suspended immediately. His record will be restored pending formal review. Marcus Vale is removed from authority, and every related file is now preserved for outside investigation. Evelyn stepped toward Dan. Name what you need. He pressed a clean cloth against his hand and looked past her at Owen, the rescued workers, and the people who had been afraid to speak. Protect them, he said.
No retaliation. No irast warnings.
Give every worker the right to stop a dangerous line. Arthur nodded. Done. The workers slowly lowered their hands, but the question remained in Evelyn's face as she watched Dan refuse the victory everyone thought he had earned. Now, that the truth had finally given him power, what would he choose to build with it? The factory floor emptied slowly after the ambulances left, and no one applauded. Workers gathered their coats, supervisors surrendered access cards, and investigators photographed the control room before sealing Marcus Vale's phone, computer, and files in numbered evidence bags. By sunrise, his authority had been formally revoked. Within the week, Shaw Aeronautics fired him for cause, referred the forged approvals and substitute part scheme to state investigators, and suspended the contractor listed on the AeroSafe invoices. Dan's termination disappeared from the company record. In its place was a written finding that his warnings had been accurate, his access had been revoked without proper review, and his actions had prevented 6 workers from being seriously injured. Arthur read the finding aloud at a public safety hearing held on the factory floor. Evelyn stood beside him beneath the same fluorescent lights that had once made Dan's worn shirt look like evidence against him. My signature helped silence a truthful employee, she said. Correcting his file is not forgiveness for that failure. It is the minimum responsibility of leadership. Dan sat in the front row with his bandaged hand resting on his knee. Lily sat beside him, safely away from the machinery, turning her Silver Star sticker between 2 fingers. When the hearing ended, Arthur led Dan into the training room. The blue maintenance notebook rested inside a glass case, not as a relic of one man's suffering, but open to the hand-drawn relief path that had saved the workers. A new plaque beneath it read, "A warning ignored is still a warning. A worker unheard is still responsible for lives." We'd like you to return, Arthur said. Director of Plant Reliability. Dan looked at the polished executive chair placed at the head of the training table. No, Evelyn lowered her eyes, accepting the answer. Dan touched the glass above Lily's scratched star. Not like that. He proposed a different structure. A reliability council with elected technicians, an independent stop work authority, dual approval for safety overrides, triple backup recording, and protection for any employee who reported altered data. The director's chair would remain empty unless worker representatives sat beside it. Arthur considered the proposal, then moved the chair away from the head of the table. Agreed. The changes did not arrive as a miracle. They came through audits, uncomfortable testimony, rewritten procedures, and months of people learning that silence was no longer the safest choice. Every injured worker received medical care and paid recovery time. Owen became the first elected technician on the Safety Council. Contractors could no longer substitute components without independent inspection. Dan returned to the factory in his old work boots, carrying the same toolbox that had once been inventoried like the belongings of a man who no longer mattered. Now younger technicians gathered around it because they knew the quiet man opening its scratched lid would teach them to listen before a machine screamed. Evelyn did not ask him to forget what she had done. She attended every review, signed every correction publicly, and accepted his distance without turning apology into pressure. Months later, she met Dan and Lily at the school science fair. Lily's repaired volcano erupted too early, sending red foam over the display cloth. Evelyn laughed only after Lily did. Dad fixed the bottom, Lily explained. He always fixes the part nobody sees. Evelyn looked at Dan. I'm beginning to understand that. Their second chance did not begin with a promise or a kiss. It began with coffee after the fair, Lily talking about planets between them, and Evelyn listening when Dan said trust had to be built in ordinary moments. On the anniversary of the accident, the workers gathered in the training room. No speeches were planned. Lily placed a new silver star on the corner of the notebook's glass case. directly above the old scratched one. "They finally heard you," she whispered. Dan looked at Owen, the rescued workers, Evelyn, and the empty chair no one owned alone. "They heard all of us." For a moment, the room held no alarm, no accusation, and no applause. Only the soft hum of a safe machine beyond the wall and the silence of people who finally understood that dignity never needed to shout. It only needed someone brave enough to protect the truth until kindness could become justice.